Hi, I'm Talya.
And I'm Victoria.
And we are two Tweedledums Thinking. And this is a special episode that will accompany episode 4.
Now, episode 4 talks about academics and tips and tricks.
Yep.
And one of the things that we talk about is academic writing. Now, what you're about to hear, it's not academic writing per se, but it was for an assignment for our English class, our IB diploma program English literature class,
Yes.
Where it was an exercise for a paper 2 assignment or a comparison essay.
Yes.
But in this case, we were able to do it in groups, and we had the option of making it into a podcast where we voiced it out and orally spoke.
Yes.
Wait, what? Spoke it to each other in a conversation setting. So it kind of combined the elements of a paper 2 where we compared 2 different texts, which in this case is Hong Kong's Human Acts and Lazarillo de Tormes by the anonymous author, and with the skills of an individual oral where we had to talk about 2 different texts within a certain time frame in an insightful, big brain way.
Yes.
Yes. So
This is a sample of our work, and I hope you guys find it beneficial to some extent.
especially for all you IBDP people,
Yes.
hopefully this gives you inspiration. And by the way, we got a 7 for this
Yes.
from our teacher, who's like very like harsh in
We were
grading.
shocked,
I was shocked.
but very pleased.
So hope you all are inspired. Bye-bye!
Hi, I'm Talya, and my co-host today is Victoria.
Hi.
In this podcast, we will be comparing Lazarillo de Tormes, a book which was written in 1554 in Spain anonymously, with Human Acts, a novel written in 2014 by acclaimed South Korean writer Han Kang. We will compare these 2 works of protest by focusing on the following prompt. How can a work of imagination, such as literature, serve as a protest in the real world? Lazarillo de Tormes and Human Acts are comparable because they are protests against institutions. Lazarillo de Tormes was written during the Spanish Inquisition when the Catholic Church pressured non-Catholics to convert. Their use of violence shows the Catholic Church as somewhat authoritarian, and Human Acts was written about the Gwangju Uprising, a protest for democracy against a violent authoritarian government. With that, we will explore both of these literary works in terms of narrative perspective, imagery, and structure. In our analysis of these 2 works, we have realized that literature can serve as a protest in the real world against broken human institutions through its ability to highlight and unpack experiences of people whose behaviors have been altered by said institutions. So why does all this matter, Victoria? A work of imagination such as literature can serve as a protest in the real world because it sucks you into a world that allows you to make connections yourself on an intimate level rather than being fed what you are supposed to know or believe from other sources like the news.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we can move into our first point, like how the authors use narrative perspective.
Right, okay. So I'm going to be the one talking about Lazarillo de Tormes. So in Lazarillo de Tormes, Lazaro is the only narrator and is told in the first-person narrative perspective, different from Human Acts.
Yeah.
While I was reading the book, something I actually found myself constantly thinking about was the reliability or lack thereof of a narrator. The further along I got in the plot, Lazaro seemed more and more unreliable because he would say something negative about his masters but copy that behavior anyway. It made me question his level of self-awareness. Was he aware of how much he had started to act like his masters? Did he realize that in spite of working for people who were supposed to be role models in society, like the pardoner or the priest, that he only became more and more corrupt? So near the ending, Lazaro actually agreed to marry the mistress of the archpriest, allowing her to remain his mistress as seen on page 43.
Ew.
Yes, ew. This shows his acceptance of the corrupt behavior of leaders in the Catholic Church in order to have, well, what's his reasoning? To have more food or something on the weekends?
Yeah.
No. As a reader, there were moments when I would feel hopeful that he actually realized he should not mimic his master's behavior because he rebuked such behavior. But like you said, he didn't. He would judge the squire for dressing extravagantly, but then he would buy clothes that looked like the squire's clothes. Lazaro's lack of verbal protest and physical protest, only protesting through his thoughts, ultimately reveals the way in which hypocrisy by figures in the Catholic Church has altered society's view on acceptable behavior.
Yeah.
I think further it appears that no matter how many times Lazaro is beat up, he chooses to take on an active role in the story, getting some sort of revenge rather than remaining the victim. And this actually highlights the poor example set by the Catholic Church. It made me wonder about whether Lazaro genuinely seeks to change or whether he is simply explaining this story because he was asked to by His Excellency.
Yeah.
Due to Lazaro's lack of obvious protest against his masters. The burden of realizing that this book is in fact a protest and criticism of the Catholic Church, in my opinion, is actually put on the reader more than I expected initially.
Yeah,
and
for
this
sure.
is very different to Human Acts, as you will explain.
Yeah, like in Human Acts, I would say most of the narrators are not particularly aware that they're speaking
Yeah.
to a particular reader, because Hong Kong is just trying to unpack what they've experienced and their feelings about the whole matter.
Right.
You know, and unlike Lazarillo, where everything is just Lazaro's thoughts and ideas and observations, Hong Kong uses different perspectives for each chapter. And
Yeah.
although it's just focused on Gwangju's victims, you know, repressive governments have existed everywhere, you know, at
For
different
sure.
times, like
Yeah,
whether it be
yeah.
the Catholic Church or the Korean dictatorship. And of course the effects remain until, you know, for many years to come. And the way Hong Kong makes this case is by writing in a way that reflects and unpacks the victims' mental states, not to depict particularly accurate accounts of the uprising, but to show how troubled they become. And like,
Yeah.
you know, we can see that from Yun Suk's chapter, The Editor, right? Like the
Yeah, for
whole
sure.
thing was written in third person, so it kind of shows her monotonous existence, how she's forgetting all the slaps, you know?
Yeah.
But like suddenly, when she watches a boy come on stage, you know, for a play that has nothing to do with the uprising, suddenly italics just break the narrative, goes to first person, and she just says repeatedly, "After you died, I could not hold a funeral, so my life became a funeral." Like,
Right.
you know, in page 71. And so like this internal mantra, I guess, like it confesses her failure to reconcile with Dong Ho's death, right? You know,
Right. Yeah.
she's haunted by the memory of how Dong Ho didn't want to come home with her, you know, and she consumes herself with guilt, even though it's technically not her fault. So, you know, I would say the way Hong Kong shifts to first person, third person, and all that, it just allows Yun Suk to confirm from her side, you know, that, you know, why she's obsessed with the fountain turning on and, you know, how she's so despondent to life. And of course, that and many of the other memories of police brutality leave her quite hollow. And similarly, we can see in Sunju's chapter about the factory girl, you know, lots of perspective shifts, you know, to explain Sunju's withdrawal and reveal what consumes her mind, you know.
Right.
And so the first person italicized breaks are titled The Uprising. And, you know, despite the name, it isn't actually about the Gwangju uprising, but it's just like short, vivid moments that happen without context, like, you know, the sound of dripping water. You know, and it is confusing because she suddenly would shift to a second person section about you remember or now, you know, and so it really confuses people. But as the chapter progresses, readers discover that the dripping water image just reminds Tunju of her abuser's footsteps, right? There is
Yeah.
an intensified effect on the reader
It's
because
pretty creepy, honestly.
it is like
Yeah.
it's like a continuous thread in her mind that's not her abuser's face or the particulars of her torture, but just the impending doom, you know.
Yeah.
And it shows how broken she is and its authoritarianism as well. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I think now I'm going to move on to our second big point, imagery. And again, I'm going to start by discussing some biblical allusions and the symbolism of wine, which comes up quite often in Lazarillo de Tormes, and how this creates imagery, which obviously helps us understand our prompt and the significance of everything. So a biblical allusion I noticed early on, which I found on page 17 actually, was when Lazaro first started working for the blind man. So the blind man made him as in Lazaro, bash his head on a bull, and at the end of the chapter, Lazaro got his revenge on the blind man by guiding him straight into a pillar, which caused him to fall backward half dead with his head split open. And this is actually an allusion to Leviticus 19 verse 14, which says, "Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your Lord, your God, I am the Lord," This verse shows the blind as vulnerable, disabled, and needing special care. which was not how the blind man was in the story, actually. He often outsmarted Lazaro, who is sighted. So regardless, the blind man is poor and does not have the best life. And though he is horrible to Lazaro, the fact that he could not even trust his servant makes me somehow empathize with him. Do you feel that?
Sure.
Yeah.
So
There is a
sad.
sense that the church is not getting a good enough, not setting, sorry, a good enough example. So the scripture itself is easier for society to ignore. Because if the leaders in the church are ignoring it, why can't peasants or poor people ignore it? And so the blind church cannot lead the blind or the helpless people.
Lol.
Yes. So in acknowledging that, we can actually see this illusion as a protest against the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
Now, moving on to the symbolism of the wine. The quote I will focus my analysis on is actually from page 14, and it was when Lazaro said about the blind man, "He used wine to wash the places where the pieces of the jug had cut me," and said, "How about that, Lazaro? The very thing that hurt you is helping to cure you." Yes, this shows that Lazaro's involvement with various masters, who are representative of the Catholic Church, causes him to receive some benefits amidst the suffering, I guess, in a way. The reason Lazaro was bashed in the first place is because he found out a way to enjoy the wine his master drank without his master's permission. With all his master's, there was always something good and even addicting, like the wine, but also a consequence that came from indulging in it. If you zoom out, I would say that it can be understood that the Catholic Church as an institution hurts society more than it actually supplies society with a means to survive or be better, leading readers to understand the book as a protest, as it shows that when the negatives and unforgivable acts of institutions outweigh the positives, something is definitely wrong and needs to change. Yeah, that's what I think. What do you think about the imagery in Human Acts?
I think Hong Kong takes a bit of a different approach in that she doesn't really use allusions. Like, yeah, she does use symbols, but not much allusions to, like, you know,
Okay.
religious things. And how she uses imagery is to paint the opposing sides, like, as black and white. Whereas, like, for Lazaro, it's kind of blurred, like, who's actually
Right.
evil, who isn't.
Yeah.
Here, you know, the freedom fighters are the good guys and the government are the bad guys. And that just helps to direct her readers to side with her, you know? So, for example, the way she uses imagery to describe gruesome violence and even, like, symbols of stationery to highlight the regime's ruthlessness. When Sonju was raped with a 30-centimeter ruler, you know, of course, that is already a very explicit image enough, right? But by specifying the weapon, like 30-centimeter ruler, like it's, you know, practically, yeah, it makes sense. Like, you know, it's an easier way to reach the cervix and stuff. But, you know,
Right.
rulers are symbols of orderliness, right? Like you
Yeah,
write
typically, yeah.
you write straight lines using it.
Yeah.
So it kind of implies the government's sick understanding of what orderliness is. Like it's like as if everything in the world is balanced and okay when protesters can't, you know, make more protesters, and their only fault is just speaking up, you know, because
They were very peaceful.
yeah, like they
honestly,
weren't, like many of them were still children, right? So, you know, these sort of explicit details kind of just arrest you because of her strong views against the government, right?
Right.
And Hong Kong easily persuades you to, like, you know, be really against them. And meanwhile, she describes the freedom fighters as, you know, innocent young people fighting for a great cause. And, you know, if you notice throughout the novel, the only ones who sing the national anthem are those freedom fighters, you know.
Right,
And
yeah.
it's pretty funny because anthems symbolize national identity and patriotism. So it's like as if they're the only true South Koreans. And she describes their singing like colossal waves and like this, like their clapping was like thousands of fireworks in page 7. Like it seems so positive, hopeful, and not violent at all. And it just shows the injustice of it. They were so good, and why were they tortured like that?
Yeah,
And,
that's true.
You know, so although she takes a black and white stance, right? These descriptions of the uprising 40 years ago help to protest, you know, things going on in Korea today. You know, like official government figures are still false about how many people have died. You know, Chun Du-hwan, although he was convicted, he was pardoned in 1997, and like they still voted for President Park's daughter, who was, you know,
Yeah, that's
tried for
true.
corruption, right? So, although, yeah, Hong Kong is protesting the criminal acts of back then, there's still such brokenness in Korea. It's like as if they've just moved on and they don't fully, you know, want to set things straight. for the record.
Right. And I guess the way this book confronts people might just be a reminder that we still have to take action today.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, now I'm gonna move on to our third and last big point, which is structure. So I will first talk about the pacing in Lazarillo de Tormes. So in most protests, I feel as though there is a sense of urgency, an understanding that the change has to happen right then and there. I guess in Human Acts, the sense of urgency is almost constant, especially compared to Lazarillo de Tormes. And though he as in Lazaro, talks about wanting to take revenge on his masters, Lazaro does not seem very frantic. And although he occasionally foreshadows something that might happen, so for example how he was bashed by the blind man and he ended up bashing him in return, it's not that obvious until it actually happens. I would say the first 3 chapters of the novel are quite long, and perhaps this is in part because he was younger and less experienced when working for the blind man and the priest and the squire. In contrast, after the 3rd chapter, Lazaro moved through his experiences quite quickly. However, this is not because Lazaro is urgent, in my opinion at least, in his protest against his masters. And instead, I think it's because he has gotten to a point in his life where the abuse from his masters is almost normal and something tolerable and not necessarily worth complaining about. Even with the way the pardoner was taking advantage of people by overselling indulgences and how Lazaro portrays him as manipulative, it can be seen, I think it was on page 41, that he actually finds aspects of it quite amusing.
Yeah.
So even through what he reveals of the pardoner, what he reveals about the pardoner, even though it's not super, I mean, he still finds it relatively funny. It is enough to make readers protest against people who are manipulative in society, especially those in positions of power, regardless of how he portrays it with some humor. And in terms of Lazaro mimicking the behavior of his masters, I have noticed this as something very constant throughout the book. Readers are unlikely to be shocked, in my opinion, when they learn that Lazaro uses what he has learned from the blind man, for example, about begging to find enough food to survive, or what Lazaro learned about having to drink wine sneakily and how it helped him steal food from the priest. I think this creates a sense that the constant immoral behavior of the Catholic Church, which is especially unsuitable for people who should be role models in society, not only creates problems which need fixing, like you can't starve your servants, I don't think. That's very bad. But it also prevents solutions from being reached. That's what I have noticed from the structure of Lazarillo. What do you think in Human Acts?
I would say Human Acts, it's I guess it's quite similar in how it's the general progression of the story arc is quite chronological from 1980 to 2013.
Right.
You know, although like there are different purposes in the way she uses structure, because the chapters themselves have quite distorted timelines, but the fact that overall it's chronological helps to give a cohesive big picture of what she's protesting, which is the lingering effects of authoritarianism. And so we see that this novel, interestingly, comes like full circle. Chapter 1, the boy, we're straight away immersed into the action of the uprising. And, you know, she right away uses, you know, evokes sympathy and concern among us, like why was the boy there, you know, at such a violent place.
That was pretty immediate.
Yeah. And, you know, as the novel progresses, we kind of go through, you know, how the other protesters' lives have become, how they felt such immense guilt over Dong Ho, and how they were tortured in different ways. And of course, those are important. But ultimately, Hong Kong returns back to Dong Ho's mom 30 years after. We see her old, kind of insane. And the sad thing is how not much has changed, you know. She's in the same way that Dong Ho was hoping to find Jong Dae in chapter 1, even though it's kind of obvious that Jong Dae might never come back. The mom is like, you know, waiting outside on the concrete, hoping to find Dong Ho come home. You know, and so I find it funny, like how, not funny, but interesting in the ending, how, you know, it's rather ambiguous compared to like the rest of the novel that's very like straightforward and explicit, right? When we see her anecdote about walking with Dong Ho by the river, you know, we don't know if she's actually hallucinating or like, is she actually like dying? But, you know, regardless, Hong Kong emphasizes the existing contrast of, you know, the shade and the sun, gadflies and flowers, Dong-ho as her source of grief and joy. And it just emphasizes her message in such a beautifully metaphoric way that coming into the light of a newer era of democracy and everything today does not erase the death and darkness of back then, you know. As much as things are back to normal, you know, injustices can't be forgotten. And so it is in that ambiguity that, you know, readers kind of think about that even more.
Yeah.
And so, you know, all the chapters paint how authoritarianism has altered the spirit. Kind of like, you know, Lazarillo. As it progresses, you see there's a bit of a change in him, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, I feel like overall, after this whole discussion, you know, definitely we see much relevance between what happened back then with the Catholic Church and even the Gwangju Uprising, even until like today, because we still see cases of, you know, religious oppression, how religious people use, you know, the name of religion to justify evil acts, how, you know, there are still many dictatorships going on in the world and people are protesting, you know, and of course the subject matter is different, right? The characters are different, but at the end of the day, why this all matters to other works of protest as well is that these authors give a voice to people who, you know, normal people don't really think about or haven't even realized exist, and victims don't really want to speak up themselves. So it gives representation to them, I think. And
yeah, I would have to agree with what Victoria is saying. Even though the Gwangju Uprising as well as the Spanish Inquisition happened in the past and we can't necessarily do anything to change it, the little things we can learn or observe from both of these works of literature can help us to become more contributing members of society and to figure out what needs protesting and what we should focus our energy on. Yeah. So I guess that's where we can see some of the significance. And do you have anything else to add, Victoria?
I think I just want to say thanks for listening.
Yes, thank you for making it this far. And yeah,
We'll see you.
Bye, see you.